知道。好像也不能，好像可以。
I'm only going back tomorrow evening, so.
Good afternoon, everyone. In the spring of 2017, our beloved Professor Li Yih-yuan passed away, and in the autumn of 2017, we established this Li Yih-yuan Lectureship to commemorate Professor Li Yih-yuan's contribution to this institute and to the anthropology in Taiwan. And this is the second time, and we are honored to have Professor Comaroff here. I will give a brief introduction in case some from outside anthropology field. Professor Comaroff is a distinguished scholar who has changed the course of several fields, including the anthropology of Africa, political anthropology, and legal anthropology, and who has theorized the global crisis of the past few decades in ways both sobering and inspiring. Professor Comaroff earned his PhD from the London School of Economics. He is now the Hugh Foster Professor of African and African American Study and of Anthropology and Oppenheimer Research Fellow in African Study at Harvard University. Before taking up his position at Harvard, he was in the Anthropology department at the University of Chicago for over 30 years. The majority of Professor Comaroff's fieldwork has been done in South Africa and Botswana. In his early work, his careful ethnography of Tswana marriage, witchcraft, and conflict resolution demonstrated the flexibility and creativity of law and the inseparability of the legal from the political. His more recent work creates a bridge between an ethnography of the Tswana and other indigenous African people and observation, both detailed and wide-ranging of global trend. Most of this research and writing has been done together with his wife and fellow anthropologist, Jean Comaroff. The Comaroff's publications are too numerous to go through them all, so I will here only mention three. In Of Revelation and Revolution, Volume 1 and 2, they examine the encounter between Christian missionary and the Tswana, both in the colonial era and the present, looking at how this encounter reverberates in many aspects of cultural life, from market to medicine to architecture. Second, in Ethnicity In, they explore how non-Western people have been imbricated within global neoliberalism, and ethnic groups and nations are increasingly modeling themselves on the cooperation. And third, in their recent theory from the South, they look at recent development in the West that seem to be replicating colonial and post-colonial conditions in the global South, and how the implication of such trend as obsession with corruption, crime, and ethnic conflict look in the light of non-Western experience and the analytical tools that have been developed on the ground to make sense of them. This is Professor Comaroff's third time to visit Taiwan, he just told me. And we are eager to hear about his and Jean's most recent work. And today's title is After Labor. So please join me to welcome Professor Comaroff.
Thank you ever so much, Director Chang. It's really a pleasure to be back here My first visit, which we've actually debated a little bit in terms of time. One of the advantages of getting old is that your memory of time tends to concertina a little bit. But it was 1997, and it is especially memorable for me because when I was invited to give a lecture on the nature of the colonial state, which I'd not written about before, in fact, on which it was a rather narrow literature. And the invitation forced me to think about something in ways that I never had before. And the seminar that ensued was one of the most invigorating intellectual experiences I actually remember in a very long time. And the essay that I wrote as a result, which was published then, has now been translated, I think, into 7 or 8 different languages and is a standard college text in the US. And believe me, I was only one of the co-authors. The other co-authors were sitting in this room or a room like it at the time. So I have an enormous debt of gratitude to Academia Sinica, and I have really enormously warm memories of being in Taiwan. I also am very gratified by the invitation to give this lecture. Memorial lectures are always special occasions, but this seems to be a special occasion because after all it's named for a great anthropologist and somebody who was instrumental in making a national anthropology, and that is very distinctive and very special. And ritual moments, as every anthropologist knows, are moments to be taken extremely seriously, and hence I take this moment extremely seriously. I'd also like to thank Wayne Chang, who made this visit possible and is an extremely elegant host. In fact, I have been really honored by the extraordinary hosting that I've received. So this is not quite my after labor, that'll be in about an hour and a half's time. For now, and of course this is, as Director Chang said, a piece of work that I have done with my wife. So any I here actually hired somebody in another seat who is very much a co-author in this, in fact, very much 50%. So on to after labor. All across the globe, it seems, there is a rising anxiety that wage work, as we've long known it, is fast disappearing. Yet there is little agreement about why, about where, or in about what measure, or what might actually take its place in future. We, scholars, politicians, pundits, people at large, seem unable to think beyond a universe found on mass employment. But why not? After all, capitalism has always tried to freed itself as far as possible from a dependency on labor, often with considerable success. Indeed, it's now widely recognized, and recent historical research has shown, that more people have always been wageless than have been waged. But if employment has always been threatened by erasure, always more an aspiration than an actuality, why does it remain so central to both popular and theoretical understandings of economy and society, be it from the left or the right? How might this relate to fears for its imminent end? And more generally, what precisely is unique about this moment in the long history of labor? As we fail to imagine an age after work, we appear ever more haunted by the nightmare of our own redundancy, by surreal images of a world in which value is produced by other means, not just by finance or artificial intelligence or casualized part-timers, but by workers who are at once human and non-human, living and dead, present and absent. Put another way, what finally does this tell us about the life, the afterlife of Homo faber, of living human beings, working human beings? Answers to that question, we submit, are greatly enriched by extending our gaze beyond the vantage of Euro-America. The hemispheric north may be the traditional source and the horizon of so much of our social theory, but a comprehensive grasp of the history of labor, of its futures, and of global capitalism at large has a need to embrace the entailment of the Euro-modern world in its outsides, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, the source, after all, of much of the animating energy of what we once called the West, and of its most precarious, its most devalued, its most dehumanized forms of human toil. It's a history whose southern and eastern past the North seems to be reliving, albeit, perhaps, unwittingly. In the late 1990s, zombies began to appear in South African popular discourse. Although foreshadowed in local cultural imaginings, their arrival was both sudden and unexpected. Yet its timing was not serendipitous. It occurred as the already fragile infrastructure of black life was threatened quite abruptly by a radically shrinking job market. There was a cruel irony here. Wage labor was being made superfluous just when decolonization was supposed to put an end to the racial capitalism of apartheid, of colonialism, promising, quite explicitly, secure, decently paid work for all. But the transition to democracy coincided with a worldwide wave of neoliberal reform, reversing the advance after World War II of stage-managed social welfare, of economic regulation, and of redistribution. In the upshot, post-authoritarian societies like South Africa experienced the moment as an anguished mix of enfranchisement and dispossession, of rights-based recognition and jobless growth, a politely evasive term for mass unemployment. At the time, the World Bank said of South Africa, its economy is in excellent shape, as 1 million jobs were lost over 6 months. It was then that rumors spread about the invading army of surrogate workers. On the one hand, of migrants from the north, said to be diseased, desperate, crime-prone, migrants ready to toil at cutthroat rates. On the other hand, are a host of beings raised by occult means from the dead, who served in a surging, secretive, nocturnal army. Together, these interlopers were blamed for the loss of jobs. And so it was that wage work, at once desired and disappeared, present and absent, returned in spectral guise. Zombies, figures who lack the animating qualities of personhood, bodied forth in popular rhetoric, in rumor and media reportage, in legal disputes, often murder cases, and in industrial conflicts. Indeed, Jean and I encountered several ourselves during our ethnographic work and wrote a number of essays about them. Because they lack human needs, these living dead are pure surplus labor, pure surplus value. They exist, we were told, often at the time, by quotes, eating away at the lives and the livelihoods of others. To be sure, they've been a ghostly present, Walter Benjamin's profane illumination, throughout the history of modernity, reappearing at moments of rupture in prevailing relations of production in the Caribbean, in West Africa, and well elsewhere. As figurations of slavery and colonial extraction, they entered the US vernacular during the occupation of Haiti between 1915 and 1943, to be repurposed by the American culture industry as the scientifically reanimated undead, versatile incarnations of late modern monstrosity, of predation, of horror. Hence, in our own times of crisis, the circulating tropes of zombie banks, zombie corporations, voodoo economics. Tellingly, South Africa's bankrupt electricity company, Eskom, said to be the world's largest power utility, has been dubbed a zombie apocalypse. No wonder then that activists staging a public protest last month to reclaim Cape Town for the poor came dressed up as zombies. As a product of preternatural accumulation, zombies bear uncanny resemblance to recent fictional figures of proletarian undoing, like the so-called equisapiens, half-horse, half-black man of Bruce Riley's searing movie, Sorry to Bother You, a major hit in Euro-America. This image recalls a point made about racial capitalism, by Hilton White, citing Moishe Costone's famous analysis of the iconography of German anti-Semitism. White suggests that, and I quote him, if Jews have historically been represented as the racial body of money without labor, blacks are stereotyped as labor without will, labor in itself, a brute biological force in need of mastery. Riley's horse people are precisely that power, horsepower, in genetically engineered form, half man, half beast, fully exploitable. The invention of worry-free, a fictive firm, these mutant workers are ostensibly more effective, cheaper, better than robots. Now, robots, of course, are the other nemesis of Homo faber. A new sociological study entitled, tellingly, "You're Fired, Says the Robot," reports a pandemic in the American workplace of technophobia, an anxiety-related syndrome centered obsessionally on robotics and artificial intelligence. Nor only in America. An anguished op-ed last year, 2018, by the head of the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, featured a picture of the first humanoid robot in the country. Tellingly white in color, the national flag painted on its chest, it stared defiantly into the fearful eyes of its black creator. Like the zombie, the robotic android, a body eviscerated of life, makes real the fantasy of production without human toil. Even in the face of the putative end of wage employment, we remain trapped in its fetishized logic. The android and the zombie alike appear as doppelgangers, as doubles of living labor return, if only to be effaced, an estranged recognition of the unthinkable, of world without work. This also recalls the underworld worker zombie killers in red hard hats and overalls that almost robotically invade the urban scape of Jordan Peele's similarly popular film Us. Us as in we, but us as in the US. They make the point in surreal form that it is the commodity economy itself, however apparently benign, however apparently yielding of value, that also yields redundant workers. Now, both zombies and androids will reappear as my story unfolds. But speaking of the commodity economy, however, and the role of labor in it, a prior point is to be stressed. It's little more than a cliche to note that the social world under capitalism as an historical formation is constituted primarily by wage work. At the same time, several theorists have argued, it is a formation with a contradiction at its core. On the one hand, as I've already intimated, its development over time, most recently with globalization, the financialization, and the digital revolution, has rendered wage labor increasingly anachronistic, past the sell-by date, increasingly irrelevant to the generation of wealth. To wit, stock markets typically rise as workers are laid off. And yet, on the other hand, that form of labor remains ontologically indispensable to capitalism, essential to its self-understanding, its endogenous sense of how value is created, which perhaps is why, as wage work is devalued and displaced, it tends to return these days, in both theory and in life, in refigured, dehumanized forms. Hence the robot, hence the zombie, hence the mutant, each a spectre of human toil under erasure, human toil that retains the traces of its earlier significance, yet in Derrida's terms is rubbed out. This paradox, that labor is integral to social being, it is undone by the historical conditions under which it evolved, is, we suggest, critical for making sense of contemporary debates about the future of work. Now, modernist conceptions of labor not coincidentally connive in this counterpoint of indispensability and irrelevance. Those conceptions draw on the submerged theological roots of liberal thought, in which work is the defining attribute of species being, of the capacity to transcend nature, to acquire property, to make history, to reach for the gods. Foucault, recall, spoke explicitly of its sacred powers, its universal necessity. Romantics, early and late, have insisted that labor transcends its instrumental function. It is artful, it is ethical, it is creative, it is redemptive. Liberal and Marxist thinkers too, even while seeing it at root as a practical, remunerated activity, tend to invest it with dignifying, emancipatory potential. But this is in spite of the fact that wage employment has always been, for the most part, coerced, for the most part a consequence of dispossession, albeit of diverse kinds, at different times and in different places. In spite, too, of the fact it has long been entailed in a political economy bent on accruing profit by variously dehumanizing, by variously more or less exploitative means, which by extension makes alienated toil a almost unrealizable ideal. Relevant in this regard is the feminist objection that received conceptions of work have remained irredeemably narrow and masculinist, perennially romanticizing domestic activity while ignoring its essential contribution to the generation of wealth and to the accretion of social value. Likewise, the observation of critical scholars to the effect that the structural articulation of gender with race has served further to discount both female and racialized labor, thereby providing a double subsidy to commodity production. Now, the corollary is clear. Capital, throughout its history, has fused multiple modes of extraction, relying, as Rosa Luxemburg insisted, on various and variously violent practices of what she called primitive accumulation alongside free labor. Hence, for example, the coining of hybrid terms like semi-proletariat to describe colonial class formations to whose traces are returned. Hence also the ideological work entailed in defining, in classifying, and in ascribing relative value, or indeed no value at all, to human activity. Ascription that mobilize axes of difference, race, gender, age, and types of toil, skilled, unskilled, domestic, productive, to recognize, to prioritize, to rationalize, and to remunerate activity, or, of course, not to remunerate it at all. Self-evidently then, the commodity economy has always been more diverse, more synthetic in its labor regimes than its own narratives are wont to suggest. The more general point, that this historical formation has reenacted repeatedly, if in different mutations, the contradiction at its core, asserting the centrality of free labor while simultaneously undermining it. The proliferation of occupations, of skills, of kinds of compensation implicated in the restructuring of production since the late 1970s plays out much the same contradiction, if in a different key. The flexible conditions of work, the new sorts of contract, and deregulated modes of accumulation that have emerged in these past decades, their uncertainties, their precarities, their ruptured temporalities, may seem unprecedented. In the age of rampant financialization and rising self-employment, they may even appear to have emancipatory possibilities. Hence, the celebration by those who call themselves post-workists of life beyond formal employment and the daily grind of what David Graeber has called bullshit jobs. Also by those who, like Arthur Negri and Ulrich Beck, claim that more fluid, intelligent forms of labor might eventuate in a new commons, in a new civil society, in what they call a new grammar of the multitude. In other words, in better and more decent social life. But much of what look to be new sorts of occupations actually go back a long way, unremarked and unremunerated, only to return in renamed and rebranded guise. The flexibility and casualization associated with what has come to be called neoliberalism merely put a techno-economistic gloss on forms of job insecurity, of piecework, of underemployment, and the scanting of labor protections integral long to the age of industry. emergent categories like affective or immaterial work may acknowledge feminist demands for recognition of the unwaged labor of domestic reproduction. But they also tend to sentimentalize that labor, as I've noted, replaying the rhetoric that historically has underwritten the confinement of women's activities, the handmaid's toil, if you like, to the priceless space of the home. Even when recognized now as a bona fide job, affective toil, caring, cleaning, waste management, remains the underpaid work of the public domain. How then is the contradiction at the core of the relationship between capital and labor resolved these days in our troubled times? Why do received forms of work, rendered anachronistic, redundant, surplus to requirement, why do they still retain their elemental significance? And why do they keep returning, often in metamorphosed, sometimes spectral guise? How more broadly are we to think an anthropology for labor in our times? A historical parenthesis at this point, albeit an important one, courtesy of Thomas Piketty and others, who remind us that patterns of inequality have fluctuated visibly over the past century in tandem with other economic indices and the fortunes of labor. After a period of slow growth, slow growth, accompanied by deepening inequality during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there came a phase post-World War II, during which growth and per capita GDP more than doubled. Wages rose significantly, and levels of inequality dropped sharply, only to be followed from the early 1970s onwards by a dramatic reversal. Since 1973 and on into the continuing present, growth and GDP have waned, living standards have dropped for many across the planet, income gaps have widened enormously, and rates of debt have skyrocketed. Now, that optimal period from 1945 until the 70s is associated in the archaeology of capital with state-centric Fordism, underpinned by Keynesian ideology of economic management, and by sanguine imaginings, at least partly realized, of a world of full employment, of workers' rights, of comprehensive social welfare, extending to the protection of citizens against joblessness, homelessness, illness, and indigence. Now, a quick look at the employment figures in this regard, figures, as we shall see, that hide more than they reveal, tells a story. In the USA, for example, joblessness in the late 1960s was never higher than 3.8%, and often markedly lower. In the 1980s, the early years of the Reagan administration, as the Fordist era gave way to the so-called neoliberal, it rose dramatically to 10.8%, in other words, by 300%. Unlike the UK, whose jobless figures for 1945 to 1971 peaked at 2.7% and often dropped much lower, as low in fact as 1.2%. In 1983, under Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party, it reached a staggering 12.9%, 10 times as much. Significantly, the history of trade unions echoes those trends. In 1954, 35% of all American workers were union members. That figure fell to 20% in 1983, soon after the attack on labor by the Reagan administration. It now stands at 11% and dropping. British unions at their height in the 1960s and 70s were also radically undermined during the 1980s at the behest of the Thatcher government and its corporate backers. Now, the ironies in all this are unmistakable. If growth and GDP are taken to be significant indices of material well-being, both the US and the UK were at their healthiest when jobless rates were at their lowest, unions at their strongest, wages rising, one might add also taxes at their highest, and inequality at their most attenuated. Of course, any number of contingencies affect fluctuations in employment and inequality, among them inflationary cycles, recessionary pressures, market corrections, and political upheavals. But my point doesn't lie in the specificity of the numbers. It lies in the fact that they speak, if tacitly, to a historical consciousness that recalls the post-World War II decades with regard to national economies and societies in a very particular way. That period remains in historical consciousness in a very particular way. Those decades, the coming of age years of the still powerful baby boomer generation, sustains a paradigmatic presence in the contemporary sociological imagination. This, in many ways, was the moment at which liberal democratic modernity, as retrospectively remembered, reached its optimistic zenith, at which talk of the Great Society, in its various global northern guises, appeared most persuasive, at which poverty and insecurity seemed to recede in the face of the norm of lifelong employment, at which the struggle for civil rights and the recognition of difference, most notably in respect of race and gender, look like it made its most permanent advances, at which too the global south still looked forward to a hopeful future. But hiding in plain sight, just off camera, there lurked persisting forms of exclusion, of inequity, and of raw injustice. In immiserated US inner cities, for example, and the bleak northern estates of Northern Ireland, in the poorer reaches of immigrant England, the site of xenophobic outbreaks, in the violent theatres of neo-imperial warfare in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and in innumerable elsewheres. Now, some would see in those places, in the penumbra of the Cold War, the possibility of popular struggles against prevailing structures of domination. Hence the rise of black power movements in the West, the emergence of socialist regimes in former colonies, and the optimism of the new left in Europe. At the same time, however, there occurred in counterpoint a resurgence of conservative forces that opposed any kind of welfarism, any kind of welfare etatism. In the US, of New Deal liberalism, in Europe, of labor-driven socialism, casting them both as a danger to the freedom of persons and of markets, and as a harbinger, foreshadowing of totalitarianism. From the 1970s onwards, those forces were to capture the political center and push ideological orthodoxy in a contrary direction. A parenthesis here, one of my fondest lessons to my graduate students is to ask them who was further to left, Barack Obama or Richard Nixon? The answer is clear. For its part, business reacted to the gains made by workers and civil rights movements in Euro-America by devising new free trade mechanisms under a program of global restructuring oriented toward altering supply chains, production, and the organization of work. And so the long dialectical struggle between capital and labor entered its latest chapter. Wherever it could, capital, embodied in an ever more sovereign corporate sector, pushed for privatization, deregulation, financialization, reduced legal liability, and policies of austerity at home. Still, for all the reverses that have occurred since the post-war conjuncture, 1945 to the 70s, that period continues in critical respects to be the received template against which social expectations tend to be measured, even as the deficit between those expectations and lived reality appears to grow with each passing year. And so it remains plausible to speak in the future perfect tense of mass employment and secure salaried work for all, undergirded by a modernist mythos honed in an age in which labour seemed to approach the most equitable possible pact with capital, in which also, as I've said, the liberal ideal of redistributive democracy seemed within reach. It is a mythos that lingers on, even as for more and more people, its promise recedes into the realm of the unreachable, the unreal, the unrecognizable, and, especially for rising generations, the unthinkable. Which takes us back to reality's present, to a present continuous, now 50 years in the making, a present without a foreseeable denouement. These past decades have seen the convergence of two processes that together have shaped this latest chapter in the relationship between capital and labour, and specifically of the contradiction at its core. The first of those processes patently lies in what I mentioned a moment ago, in the morphing planetary workplace as the corporate sector has built global commodity chains and with them its regimes of accumulation. Partly by recommissioning the structures of colonial extraction, partly by capturing post-colonial states, it has recalibrated many of its operations, rendering mobile its sites of manufacture and its lines of distribution. Already in the 1970s, this was anticipated conceptually in what some Western economists call the new international division of labour, a realignment marked primarily by the migration of proletarian jobs from north to south, primarily in response to falling rates of profit, to rising worker demands for better wages, and to various forms of deregulation. In the world still known then as Third, labour, of course, was much cheaper and less protected. It was also centred in major measure on household, on kin, on communal, and on ethnic ties. Violent extraction at those edges of empire has always been the underside of the Euro-modern romance of free labour. There, everyday economic life necessitated a labile mix of subsistence and petty commodity production, occasional contract work, migrant labour, and penny capitalism in the informal sector. And it often demanded highly creative credit management. Now, these were, and they are, social ecologies in which rank poverty imposes on individuals and families, especially on women, an onus for diversified survival strategies, which perforce often include, in addition to informal enterprise, taking the lowest paid, the most insecure, the most menial jobs available. A parenthesis here, after South Africa won the World Rugby Cup a couple of weeks back, its captain was interviewed on worldwide television, and the most shocking thing that emerged out of it was that he grew up in a household in which he was not guaranteed a meal every day. 7 meals a week was the highest expectation he had for self-feeding. And he tells the story of how his mother battled and how every night they went to bed wondering if they would eat the next day. That's the context in which I feel, by the way. No surprise then that it is the former colonies of the South in which both corporate capital and its rogue competitors, think blood diamonds, human trafficking, narco-commerce, have turned in the quest to extract optimal returns. Fabrication in these contexts tends to be reduced to its most elemental, to one operation in the supply chain paid minimally for each productive act and for nothing else, and likely to move on abruptly if conditions favour doing so. In the age of the planetary labour market, writes Mark Graham, millions of jobs can now be done from almost anywhere on Earth, even at the level of the micro task, enabling firms to take advantage of a global reserve army of labour on a per-click or per-pick, rather than on a per-person basis. Employees in rural Central Africa, for example, may toil in the most advanced of tech industries, sometimes in open-air factories, carrying out routine, repetitive, piecemeal tasks, like basic data recognition and classification, that machines cannot yet perform. But they are told nothing about the productive process of which they are merely a dispersed part, nor about the fact that their own work, the very work they're doing, is likely soon to render them redundant. These geographies of production, adds Graham, exert, and I quote him, huge downward pressure on wages and working conditions everywhere, and they decimate labour markets in the north. Now, Kaushik Basu, just one voice in a fast-growing literature on globalization, work, and inequality, refers to this effect of planetary articulation as labour linking. the open-air factories of the Central African countryside and the shuttered industria of US inner cities are tied integrally to one another, even when the ties that bind them drop out of visibility. What happens in Congo, Brazzaville, affects what happens in Detroit tomorrow, next week, the month after. What is more, post-colonial work continues to survive mechanization in some places because some African workers remain cheaper than machines. Even skilled ones may cost less to capital than their robotic equivalent, as they do, for example, in African ports, notes Nina Sylvanus, where, unlike, say, in Hamburg or in Rotterdam, crane operators have not been substituted by non-human solutions. I love the term solutions for human beings, at least not yet. Nonetheless, the informal employment market, even at its most abject, has shrunk in both the North and the South. Now, here is where the second of those two processes comes into play dialectically. With the attenuation and with the casualization of so much of the labor force of the North, there has arisen a lively facsimile and the capture of rising numbers of people, workers and post-workers alike, in a world of inescapable spiraling debt. In fact, there is now an emerging body theory that says, if you want to understand capitalism, forget capital and labor. Look at debtors and creditors. That is the new nexus of all opposition. That is the new nexus of struggle. That is the new nexus of politics. Now, this creeping informalization in the North is actually echoing the South and is being subsumed partly by the growing gig economy and partly by other economies that are proliferating in inverse relationship to formal work. We've all heard them: the sharing economy, the caring economy, the artisanal economy, the hospitality economy, the criminal economy, the intimate economy, the cartel economy, ... add your own, and we could be here for the next hour. None of them either conventionally proletarian or regularly waged. And all of them depend to a large extent, on commodifying the means of ordinary life. Means once vested, or once viewed in mainstream Euro-America as beyond the market, but now treated as micro-capital to be put to the purposes of accumulation. Yet another parenthesis. In South Africa, for example, when the state gives people houses, which everybody has a right to under the dignity clause, almost immediately the recipients will rent that house out and build a shack and live in the basement, in the backyard, because it becomes their one capital form. Their right to possession is a form of capital, monopoly capital, that then enters into the commodity market, while they simply shrink back literally into a different kind of temporary, of informal space. And that is almost universal in South African housing. Now, focused on the household and more broadly on the private sphere, informalization, and this is what's interesting about it, informalization ruptures the received lines between production, reproduction, between male and female, between work and leisure. And so the infrastructure and the accoutrement of the domestic domain, bedrooms, cars, computers, phones, kitchens, dining room tables, are turned into speculative assets, yielding income from their commercial deployment. Thus does everything and everybody become capital in prospect or in practice. Everybody and everything the object of potential financialization, including most of all, as Foucault long ago reminded us, the neoliberal self, the self as monopoly capital. Of course, informal enterprises always existed, more or less overtly, in northern contexts, especially among the poor. What has changed is their proportionate relationship in labor demographics to formal employment, alike blue and white collar, male and female. Also, their recognition as a vital part of material, social, psychic, and ethical life, and their reappropriation through platform business and algorithmic capital back into the formal sector that spun them off in the first place, with, as it turns out, real economic consequences. Now, this last, platforming, on which there's also a burgeoning literature, covers a wide spectrum, much of it involving the financialization of informal activities. Activities with a long history in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Hence again, the mimicking by the North of the South. At one end of the joints, those we all know, Uber, Airbnb, which upscale and techno-rationalize ride and room sharing arrangements similar to those that arose long ago among colonial urban populations and live on today. On a more modest scale, though, for example, is Japan's lively rent-a-family industry, epitomized by a company called Family Romance, a company that, building on traditional caring arrangements with analogues across the South, markets human affection and the comforts of home, supplying fictive kin to its clients. Its business model has emerging parallels in the North, among them rentafriend.com in North America, whose services include parents for hire. Always wanted. Similarly, the explosion of peer-to-peer, P2P, lending, brokered by online firms, were their precursors in rotating credit groups across Africa and in Islamic finance. Or Feastly.com, that offers meals served in a cook's home, which recall African shebeens, past and present, where migrant laborers socialize in the living rooms of a female host, who fuses the roles of mother, of wife, and of entrepreneur, and so on and on. There are innumerable examples of what we're talking about. In point of fact, platforming does more than merely reappropriate micro-entrepreneurial labor from the informal sector. While it may stimulate enterprise, it also makes independent, truly independent contracting very difficult, and charges producers a rising percentage of their income. Those producers fall in the grey zone between the self-employed, i.e. as independent contractors, and as employees, and as a result enjoy the worst of both statuses, which is why right now there's a major case in the Californian courts by Uber drivers wanting to be reclassified as employees with all the legal protections that in fact entails. Self-evidently too, platforming renders murky, even erases the legal, conceptual, moral, and material lines between the formal and the informal. And it is extremely capacious. Just yesterday, a report came out from the World Bank suggesting that the World Bank, of all things, was aiming to platform artisanal miners in Africa, of whom there are approximately 4 million. And the idea is literally to create a registry so that an artificial intelligence program can platform them and make them available to, in effect, corporate redeployment. As avaricious expansion goes, that is quite an example, since artisanal mining keeps a lot of Africa alive. To the degree then that informalization and its platforming are rapidly gaining ground in the North, where incidentally the sharing economy is given a positive, a cost-benefit gloss for, quotes, harnessing the excess capacity of personal assets otherwise idle, just in case you don't know your dining room is idle when you're not actually eating it there, and therefore is a potential resource. Euro-America is becoming ever more to resemble the global South, living its history, to cite Svetlana Alexeyevich, as second-hand time. This, however, leaves the critical question unanswered. The contradiction underlying the relationship between labor and capital, played out recursively over the centuries, may be manifesting itself structurally in a reorganization of the global workforce, its demography, its geography, its temporality, its materiality, and manifesting itself pragmatically in a rearticulation of the lines between the so-called formal and informal economies. But how precisely is that contradiction making itself felt in the experiential and in the political fabric of everyday life in the present continues? Now, almost everywhere, to return to my narrative, public discourse primed by the mythos of the post-World War II years, and this is why those years are so important, speak as though a waged population remains the norm. Labour, as the prime basis of social value, of human dignity, and of material existence, has lost little of its fetishized hold. Ironically, while the age of work seems to have come to an end, observed Cederstrom and Fleming in their book Dead Man Working, a darkly provocative reflection on our times, working has assumed a total presence. Everyone, they say, is obsessed with it. Growing angst about its precarity has heightened its cyclic centrality. A compulsive preoccupation with employment drives mainstream political manifestos, visions of education, and criteria of self-worth. Even the finance sector, where value is accumulated by means of ever greater abstraction, this of course by distancing itself as far as possible from a commodity economy, even the finance sector harks back to the language of labour. It refers to what it traffics in as products, as though they were physical objects yielded by manufacture, to its profits as earnings, and to itself as the finance industry, as though indeed it was an industry. This is hardly surprising. Work does remain the primary means by which persons are seen to be integrated into society, economy, polity, and family, notes Kathy Weeks. It is, quote, a basic obligation of citizenship, unquote, and ethically, if not legally, something regarded as akin to a right. Statesmen everywhere speak in the promissory language of bringing back jobs. Donald Trump's notorious fixation on reviving the largely defunct US coal industry is symptomatic of the nagging impasse between the idealization of blue-collar production and its cynical decommissioning under pressures of profitability. For their part, voting publics buy into those promises. They insist on more jobs, more jobs, more jobs. The South African president used the word 36 times in a 59-minute State of the Nation speech just a few months ago. To be sure, whatever form it may assume, however it may metamorphose, the status of wage labour as the basis of species being endures with an almost uncanny, sacral persistence. And I mean sacral. In the USA, says Derek Thomas, and I quote him, industriousness has served as America's unofficial religion since its founding. The sanctity of work lies at the heart of the country's politics, its economics, and its social interactions. Similarly, Britain, says Joanna Biggs, where labour, she says, gives life meaning when religion, when party politics, and when community fall away. Nor only in those places, of course. Decent jobs for its citizenry is typically portrayed as a critical function of the state everywhere. Hence the millennial promise in government manifestos of returning people to work, even where it is patently impossible. Now, on the other side of the experiential contradiction is the popular perception that the end of work is already with us, never to be reversed. Back in the 1990s, economist Jeremy Rifkin predicted that, quote, worldwide unemployment would increase dramatically as information technology eliminated millions of jobs. His book evoked some scholarly critique for its techno-determinism and its reliance on a reductionist conception of labour. But, like Richard Sennett's account of changes in work and career at the hands of what he called corporate re-engineering, and Ulrich Beck's famous and bleak demise of work society, it resonated with a dawning American nightmare. Now, that nightmare, underscored by a 2017 McKinsey Global Report, predicted the loss of 800 million jobs to robotics alone by 2030. Just think about that. 800 million jobs to robotics alone by 11 years from now. That has echoes in other countries as well. There are moral panics about work in many countries, my own included, fueled by a rush of recent books and TV documentaries aimed at mass audiences, many of them highly apocalyptic in tone, is epitomized by a spreading rust belt where the flight of industry and the technicization of what remains have left behind cityscapes dotted with cadavers, with boarded up stores, with derelict churches and homes, with ghostly school buildings. Now, not that capital fails to find possibilities in the detritus. As Matthew Souls has observed, it has turned decay into, listen, zombie urbanism, leveraging ruins through financialization into revenant assets. You too can buy a ruin in Detroit because, goes a prediction, in 20 years' time that will accumulate value again because the city will be reborn, just as perhaps your favorite local zombie will return to life. Here too, it follows some below-radar business practices in the South, where informal entrepreneurs wrestle ravaged real estate into vibrant mercantile centres. One famous example in Africa is that of the cross-border traders who bring to life decommissioned buildings, devalued spaces, and deserted sidewalks in downtown Johannesburg, making them into bustling hubs for low-end commerce. They're quite amazing to see, by the way, and the extraordinary amount of commerce runs 24 hours a day, selling enormous quantities of objects, literally from socks to large-screen TVs. Their takings, which amount to billions of dollars, all of it in cash, exceed those of the largest shopping malls in Africa. Some of those shopping malls, of course, every bit as large as those in major American cities. Now, as we would expect, the planetary geography of labour turns out to be rather more complicated than the end of work thesis suggests. Some economists speak of the Luddite fallacy, insisting, not without debate, that new technologies tend to realign existing labour arrangements, often to positive effect, rather than merely destroy them. Many people do still work in the manufacturing and service sectors, both north and south, and not all of them obviously precariously. And with ongoing shifts in the ecology of production, new jobs are created. The low official unemployment figures for most Euro-American nation states, to be constructed in a moment, I should forewarn, make that much plain, even if they do not speak to the nature of those jobs or the fact that many of them fall a long way short of yielding a living income. Yet this hardly accounts for, or does it vitiate, the existential dislocation and the capricious trade-off of lives, of careers, and futures occasioned by the radical reorganization of work. Witness the felt effects across the world of casualization, of outsourcing, of mechanization, of the polarization of employment markets within and between nations, of the reduced quality of so many jobs, and of the struggle between generations over the right to work. Once upon a time, we thought of the major rupture in the world as a rupture between upper and lower classes. Now it is between generations. In many parts of the world, the real struggle, the struggles for the streets, the struggle for services, the struggle for the right to work, the struggle for a future, is between the generations. Just as, I should add, the current Democratic Party in the US is divided in the struggle for its generational control. Now, that, of course, evokes, again, Sederstrom and Fleming's Dead Man Working. It evokes precisely the fear-inducing zombification with which I began. The fear that intelligent machines are changing the name of the game forever. This exacerbated by the fact that they've already invaded some of the most creative, intuitive professions: medical diagnosis, criminal detection, musical composition. One has to ask, academia next? And the answer in some measure, of course, is yes. Some scholars point to the fate of horses, once seen as second only to Homo sapiens in their indispensability to economic production and to human progress. But no species, it seems, neither horse nor human, is immune from the quest at the core, the ideological core of capitalism to free itself from the millstone of labour. Remember here those equisapiens of Booth Riley's nightmare, post-humans designed to be cheaper and more efficient, not merely than humans, but even more than robots. Nonetheless, the compulsion behind the relentless effort to replace human workers with surrogates is not always reducible only to actuarial reason or to cost-benefit alone. John Seabrook's fascinating account, paradigmatic account, of the avid, expensive, and yet fruitless push to develop a smart device to pick strawberries in the US exemplifies the complex socio-political forces that intersect what otherwise might be seen as a mechanical and indeed a profit-based inevitability. The urgency to perfect a robot picker, Seabrook explained. Might seem irrelevant, right? It isn't. The urgency to perfect it is the effect of a shortage not of labor per se, but of the right kind of labor. Now, the world over, it is migrants, the abject, the discounted, the displaced, those accused of stealing the jobs of nationals who actually do agricultural work, often under conditions of virtual enslavement, work so degraded that citizens, even jobless citizens, simply will not do it. But contrary to populist misconceptions in places like England, Europe and America, many advanced industrial states, driven by other obsessions, political obsessions, have in recent years been ever more successful in curbing the entry of precisely those foreign workers, which has fueled the felt need for a technical solution in curbing the entry of those peoples. In other words, the felt need for a technical solution to a totally self-inflicted socio-political problem. Meanwhile, despite vast capital investment, it's proving extremely difficult to make machine hands replicate the speed, the stamina, the discernment of these so-called low-skilled jobbers. Yet rather than address poor wages or the abusive treatment of the industry, its leaders prefer to eliminate pickers altogether, albeit at huge cost to themselves. Now, this has its own measure of irony. Suggested a union leader, the agri-workers themselves have long been treated as robots, subjected to ever-increasing demand for greater output with decreasing regard for their human condition. But this simply underscores the question here. How, at this historical moment, is the contradiction between the ideological normative centrality of work against its imminent end? How is it reconciled in official discourse, public perception, and everyday practice? Now, the answer lies in several things, of which, given time, I offer just a brief glimpse here. The first is to be found not in its reconciliation at all, but in its empirical erasure at the behest of formal economics and of state speak, specifically in the occulting of reality by recourse to statistical reason. Put it this way: if in a population a significant percentage of those who lack jobs are made to disappear, literally discounted, the remaining proportion, those with jobs, will appear much larger. Goes without saying. It's Statistics 101. Under these conditions, there would be no army of unemployed to worry about, nor would the end of work seem imminent. For contra, full employment would seem to lie well this side of the horizon of possibility and of public policy. Thus, to sustain the dignity of labour and the wage as the mythic basis of the good life. Pure logic, right? Now, in the USA, for example, it's an interesting example, the official jobless rate now hovers below 4%. Seems pretty low, right? It conjures the illusion of almost a fully employed population. But that number only takes into account those who are positioned socially or legally to actually work for, look for work and are really doing so. It ignores entirely a much more telling figure called the employment population ratio, which is kept by the US Bureau of Labor. Now that one embraces everyone of working age, every possible person who could work in the country. Now that ratio stands at 60.3%. 60.3. That means that almost 40% of adult Americans, their sociological profiles, of course, highly predictable, are not in wage jobs. 40% of Americans are not in wage jobs. That sounds very much like the global south. Of course, it makes a mockery of the jobless rate. Likewise in the UK, where employment also is very much higher than unemployment, very much higher than the official count, and where many people are radically underemployed, or, as in the US, have given up trying to find work. You cannot find work in the US if you have any form of prison record. You simply will not be employed. This has been researched to the death. You will not be employed if you are, for example, over 40 and have any disability whatsoever, whatever the rules of equal employment. It just does not work sociologically, and it has been researched to death, literally. Now, note in that respect that workers on flexi-time, on part-time or zero-hour contracts, make up 39% of the entire EU workforce. 39% are on part-time, flexi-time or zero-contract work. Staggering. Note also that employment rates in Euro-America count all of those people as if they were fully employed. Those rates include anyone who does paid labor for 1 hour or more a week. In other words, if you have 1 hour paid work a week, you are counted as employed. A fact that grossly inflates positive employment statistics. Now, this is not to mention also that wages have fallen further in the past decade than ever in recorded history. This again, according to the US Bureau of Statistics, registering again the significant gap between a job and a livelihood. If Investopedia is correct, an average wage earner in London needs 1.6 jobs to survive minimally. That is at the poverty line. In other words, Britain's employment rate for full employment is actually 160%. In New York, that number is yet higher, somewhere between 1.8 and 1.9. And striking teachers in Kansas recently reported needing 3 jobs to make ends meet, again, which would require a 300% job rate to keep people alive. Another case this of hiding the predicament of contemporary labor, of its structural demography in occult numeration that makes phenomena appear as they disappear, a magic trick, at once absent and present. Much the same story, of course, being certainly to be told of many other European nation states. The real counts of the global north, whatever they may actually be, we don't really know, seem to be edging very quickly southward. Another closely related way of disappearing, the paradox, is to redefine labor so broadly as to embrace any form of socially productive activity, be it waged or unwaged, formal or informal, licit or illicit. This is what the 2018 European Commission on the Future of Work does in its recent report, in recognizing unpaid exertions as deserving of the dignity classically associated with wage labor. I quote them: traditional concepts of work, this echoes feminist critiques of the 1970s, must take in a much broader array of non-standard employment, including unpaid contributions to our society. Thus is the burgeoning informal economy, caring, sharing, the artisanal, the cultural, the criminal, assimilated into the new normal of the North, as it has so long been in the South. Thus, too, is the paradox annulled conceptually by including more or less anything in the category of value-producing enterprise, and asserting thereby the sustained ethico-theological centrality of work as the core of human being. For the disemployed, and all those pushed into the informal sector, what afflicts them is taken not to be structural, but the sheer misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In Detroit, or Flint, or the coal towns of Kentucky, in the silent shipyards of Glasgow, or the factory shuttered towns in northern England, or other sites from which jobs have migrated, or indeed been replaced by machines. In some, while it may be reconciled or rendered invisible by resort to the faux empirical or the misconceptual, the contradiction has not gone away, neither structurally nor phenomenologically speaking. The present is less a moment of its transcendence than one of wrestling with its constant return. Wage labour remains at the essential core of capitalism and of its culture, of species being under its political theology, of its conception of time and value, of its unstable ratio of creation and destruction, even as wage work is said to be terminally endangered at its historical end, giving way to ever more abstract, financialized forms of wealth accumulation, or, as I've offered instead, as it proceeds, changes character takes refuge in other economies, formal or informal, or in the murky, unmarked spaces between. Hence the mass anxiety that keeps reappearing in schizoid figurations of labour, living and dead, present and absent, human and post-human. In the zombie, that spectre lacking species being. In robots made to look like people, and people made to act like robots. In mutant multi-species of various kinds. Hence two more pragmatic modes of addressing that anxiety. Such things as the perennial populist calls for new kinds of job creation. The increasing, if contested campaign for basic income grants as a right of citizenship. And most of all, the pursuit of a politics that might conceive of capitalism after labour, or, better yet, reaching beyond it, toward a world productive of new forms of life and livelihood, of labour after capitalism. Thank you.
Professor Comaroff reconceptualized labor under the rapidly transforming condition of global capitalism, from zombie robot to Uber, from domestic labor to emotion economy. That's all happened in Taiwan. So we have senior anthropologists here, and also we have young friends here. I think we have a lot of in common to communicate or to ask Professor Comaroff. So that's open for questions.
Well, not to ask, to comment on. I would very much like to hear answers and questions.
Because I'm the person, I'm afraid I don't have necessarily a comment, but also kind of a question, more an open-ended question. You kind of ended on it on the very last point, sort of this question of the dignity of labor, this idea of production. So I was really curious about what your perspective was on sort of attempts, particularly by some anthropologists, to try to rethink this idea of linking labor to the idea of production. So I'm thinking obviously of James Ferguson with the whole argument about, it's all about distribution, mutuality, existential obligation, dependency, shared. I'm just kind of, because part of what you were referring to in terms of some of these reports of trying to expand the definition of labor, see how ideas of labor and distribution can indeed be kind of rethought in a less emancipatory way than perhaps Ferguson is imagining. But I'm just kind of curious, how is this an issue of getting away from the idea of value production to the idea of distribution or shares? More of a kind of open-ended kind of speculation. I don't know if basic income necessarily covers all of that. This part of it.
Thanks, it's an important question. It's a very debated one. For those not familiar, this refers to a book by James Ferguson called Give a Man a Fish, in which he argues that the last way to develop the world is to give a man a fish, or to teach him, or actually her, since production is as much in the hands of women as they are in men in Africa and many other places of the world. Teaching to fish isn't going to, what's going to do is produce more fish, the size which most people in the global south know how to fish already. So teaching them how to do something they know better than occurs in the global north, or certainly among development aid workers, seems idiotic, if not a joke. His argument is this, right? That in fact, here I'm paraphrasing, the first sentence I'm going to paraphrase him, and then, or at least not paraphrase him, then paraphrase him. He's arguing in effect that the nation state, the state is now a corporation. It's a corporate form, right? Very much like other mega corporations. The idea of the Weberian state, i.e. As a state that controls its fiscus, the means of finance, etc., which is based on bureaucratic rationality, is over. That state is dead. We now live in the age of the corporate state, which in effect manages the market. Okay. Now, what this suggests is that in fact citizens in nation states are actually shareholders, right? They're stakeholders, to use neoliberal speak, but shareholders, to use corporate speak. Okay. Under those conditions, every national member of a nation state therefore is a shareholder in the common fiscus, and therefore has a right to redistribution. Right? Very much like, say, the Native American nations like the Seminole Nation, the Seminole Nation of Florida is actually a very wealthy ethnic corporation, and they own a lot of holding companies, including things like the Hard Rock Cafe and various other global enterprises, and they make a lot of money out of it. And every year they give to every member of they call themselves the tribe, sometimes a nation, they give a shareholder dividend. Last year, if I recall correctly, somewhere around $182,000. Now, Ferguson actually is thinking in those kinds of ways. He doesn't believe that there should be a basic income grant in the sense of giving out as charity in a world still governed by production, but rather that most people are not going to work in the future, and therefore the problem of actually a living is, people are not going to die. The alternatives are to go into crime, primarily, or to go into the informal economy, which also saturates itself. Therefore, he argues, we have to think about how, in effect, people are going to survive. Now, nations, by and large, are fairly wealthy. Okay? They have the capacity for income streams through taxing corporations, through various forms of royalty. In some nation states, the one I'm working in now, Singapore, by holding sovereign funds, and goodness knows what else, which operate as financial speculators. They're basically venture capitalists. Therefore, every member of the nation ought to get get a distribution, a dividend, every month of every year, and should survive on it. So he argues that the politics of the future is a politics of redistribution or distribution, not the politics of production. Don't try and find jobs that are not going to exist. Don't try to teach people to fish because it's redundant. Give people what they actually already own, which is a share in their nation state, which sounds logical. It is also, by the way, the basis, I'll come to the illogic in a moment. It's also the basis on which candidate Tang has entered into the Democratic primaries. On the day, Andrew Yang, sorry, right. Andrew Yang has entered in on the grounds of offering every American $1,000 a month. Now, note, this does not separate rich from poor, right? It is a national dividend. So every member of the nation is a stakeholder in that sense. Where it's run into problems for Ferguson is that basically South Africans hate it. First of all, they say it's impossible because if you actually do the math, it doesn't work. It doesn't work remotely. Also, right now, in most nation states, with tax revolts, in effect, it's very hard to think of taxing corporations or indeed the wealthy, as we know what the reaction is in the States to that, makes it but also because an enormous number of South Africans, especially black South African unemployed males, where the crisis of reproduction, we want to work. Labour is about dignity. And we don't want to work for nothing either, because that actually devalues us. It takes us back into the... So there's been a very negative reaction to the book, both on its actuarial grounds and on its sociological grounds. At the same time, there is an enormous amount of debate over the ways in which that general idea, not related to Ferguson, that general idea can, in fact, create a new kind of labour politics. For example, in collective ownership of mines and extractive industries, that kind of stuff. So the book has been extremely useful in sparking a debate, and unlike most anthropology texts, it actually has entered into the public domain. People, I was going to say people read it, but nobody reads the books. People quote it regularly. Right. It's like satanic verses. Everybody knows exactly what the content is before you've even read the cover. But everybody's debating it, and that is itself a useful thing. And it does raise the question of what, in fact, the rights of citizenship really do promise, and what demands of a politics of redistribution are. Because Ferguson is right in one respect, and that is, until one can envisage redistribution, whether it is reconstructing, as Elizabeth Warren is arguing, reconstructing taxation of the rich and corporations, there is no basis for not necessarily the redistribution of income, but the redistribution of the public good. After all, part of the problem of a place like Detroit is not simply that people don't have work, but people don't have the kind of education that's going to get them anywhere near a job market, or is going to keep them out of the criminal economy and therefore out of prison. I have African-American grandchildren, right? And my grandson, who is now 18 years old, is terrified that he's not going to reach 25 outside of a prison. Right? He's absolutely terrified. And if you look at his statistical charts, he's absolutely right. And that has to do with the fact that the whole socioeconomic structure of race and class in America, until that is fundamentally addressed, that can only be readdressed not by redistribution of incomes, but by redistribution of infrastructure. And so the kinds of debates that emerge out of that are very productive and very useful. So I think that's where the guts of the issue lies.
Comaroff share with us his personal experience. So who else? Actually, we named this study group, and many of us has read papers, books.
I have a question. I can just talk a little bit more now. Earlier you said that the Bavarian state as it exists is dead, and I would like to return a little bit more back to the religious angle regarding work. So if that is so, then would you say that the Protestant ethic as well, which is taken to be foundational to the development of capitalism in the West, is that dead as well? And if so, why is it that the vocabulary for talking about work remains, I would say, fundamentally Christian? In thinking about what the dignity of work, the right to work, and how it is intrinsic to still like this understanding of humanity. And in a way that is really no different from the much more obvious and more easily controversial Christian discourse of the so-called dignity of the person.
That's a terrific question, and it's a very important one. Actually, Gina, I've written a couple of essays about that question precisely because it's so significant a part of the contemporary moment. It's interesting that, as you phrased it, which is exactly right, by the way, you shifted from the Protestant ethic to its legalities. Of course, the right to work is a legal construct, and all the great religions are deeply enshrined in an ethic of legalism. Whether it's Sharia or whether it's the laws of Exodus or whether it is in the constitutionality of Protestant Christianity. In fact, it's precisely those legal structures which underpin the formation of modern capital, including, of course, the very nature of the labour contract, which is a contract according to which you or I sell our labour in a free market. This is ideologically, of course, and that establishes a labour contract, which in effect reenacts the foundational contract of modern liberalism, the social contract in which we each give up part of our freedom in return for the security of the state. Okay, so those sets of ideas are deeply enshrined. What is interesting about the present moment, of course, is that we moved away from a notion of the social into the hyper-legalistic. Right? We think of almost everything. And, remember Maggie Thatcher, The Death of Society, produced in the most famous of all British philosophy journals, the Ladies' Home Journal, 1980. Society is dead. Maggie Thatcher was actually right ideologically. That is to say that the whole neoliberal ethos, whatever that term might mean, has been about the death of society. Hence Foucault's society needs to be defended, and etc. And what that was replaced by is an emphatically legalistic kind of notion of the personal contract. But how does that eventuate in contemporary Christianity? Is it in the Protestant ethic as envisaged by Weber? Remember, Weber's Protestant ethic was what gave us the notion of the rise of the British working class and its equivalents in Europe. That is to say, a working class governed by what E.P. Thompson called time, work, discipline, and industrial capitalism, regulated by the clock, regulated by the notion that in selling your labor, you entered into a formal contract with your work, so that, for example, if you slacked, you were stealing from your employer because you contract to sell your labor at a particular rate, etc., etc. Now, of course, all that in especially Methodism and reformist religion in Britain was precisely about writing that as a moral, an ethical, and a religious principle. John Wesley, there was a thing called the Christian political economy at the beginning of the 19th century. John Wesley wrote about the precious talents of money. So this was a very dense notion of literally a Christian-based capitalism. comes the contemporary, the neoliberal, and what replaces that? Because, of course, if society goes, so does society as moral order. And what replaces it, of course, is Neo-Pentecostalism. And Pentecostalism has a very different notion of temporality, of reward, and in fact, Neo-Protestantism and the mega church has a distinctly different idea of the temple. Find a mega church in America or in Africa or whatever, and it is literally founded on the notion of the business ethos, right? Flexibility. And this appears, by the way, in a huge argument right now about church architecture. Should we build those kind of Saarinen structures anymore? Or should, in fact, churches be as mobile as capital is? Should we be able to move our Pentecost around? Should our temples move with people? How do we create a new Christianity? And in fact, there's an enormous amount of social theology about just this point. And a lot of the great kind of global mega churches like the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which emanates from Brazil and now is found in basically every village south of the equator in Africa, promises direct rewards on worship. There's also fee-for-service religion. Right? You come, you contribute, you pray, and you get your reward. And in fact, they are storefront churches, i.e., they are in the fronts of stores. Okay, literal, storefront churches. And many of them actually construct their ritual calendar by virtue of the pragmatics of everyday life. Mondays, prayers for small businesses. Tuesday, prayers for saving societies. Wednesday, anti-witchcraft. Thursday, etc. They literally are calendars. And what is more, they see themselves as literally microcosms of nation states. In fact, the theology of the Universal Church has a statement that pastors make regularly. And it goes like this. When the credits of your life roll by, they have a very cinematic image of the life cycle. When the cinematic credits of your life go by, it will not be to the nation state that you'll give thanks. It is not your ethnic groups that you'll give thanks, but it is to the Universal Church of God. And so the notion of interpolating citizenship in religion in that kind of way has become, as it were, the neo-Protestant ethic and the neo-capitalism. And it appears a highly functional relationship. It's not a highly functional relationship, it's a mutually conditioning relationship. It's a dialectical relationship. And this is why Pentecostalism is spreading as quickly as it is, precisely where informal economies arise. And what is more, it is springing up especially in migrant communities, and what is more, migrant communities actually that carry mobile Christianity down migrant course with them. Some parishes are buses. You see buses from Somalia moving through Kenya, through Zimbabwe, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, literally praying as they go. Okay, this is mobile Christianity for a mobile sense of the present. It's a fascinating topic, but the mutual, the dialectical interconnection between Christianity and capitalism is there, both shading into its contemporary. That doesn't mean that it's lost its past, quite the opposite. Nothing of the present loses its past. It simply rearranges it, reconditions it, and reproportions its elements in different kinds of ways. Sorry, a long answer, but it's an intriguing question.
For the talk is very inspiring, and I think we still need some ice-breaking questions. So if you don't mind, can I ask you to elaborate I just try to pick up what you say in the talk, and I'm actually wondering how the examination can apply to academia.
Academia?
Yeah, because I found your talk especially relevant to contemporary time and also very relatable. And since then, it makes me to reflect on my situation right now as a postdoc. So, and I found it especially interesting when you talk about fictive empirical, and I think it's especially true when people talk about the job market in academia right now. People will say there's just not enough placement, and I think your talk exactly talk to the problem here. So I just wonder if you have other thoughts, and I would like to hear. Thank you.
Thank you for ice-breaking. I appreciate it. It's an interesting set of questions because there are a number of ways of answering it, right? And I'd like to say maybe three things about it. The first is that I think that all this presents a real theoretical challenge to anthropology and social science. I think we're still operating with analogical categories in the digital age. Okay, the concepts of society, the nation, the state, that we operate fall back into a middle modernist kind of default, and the world is changing much faster. Interestingly, I mean, I find that I learn much more from informal traders that I work with in Cape Town and in North South Africa than I learn from my colleagues at Harvard, because their analyses of the world really are prompted by survival. Right? They've got to get it in order to live. And whether they're going to, in fact, continue, for example, trading clothes or buying a gun for approximately $50 and entering the hijacking economy, really is determined by precisely the way that they read the street. Okay, so they are all organic ethnographers. And one of the things that one learns from them is many of our concepts are way out of date. Right? We think, for example, of precarity as though it were a single thing. Right? We're all precarious because ultimately, if you're middle class, you're one misfortune away from poverty. Workers are all precarious because they may lose their job. Actually, lumpen proletarians, as they were once called, don't experience precarity in the same way as middle class do. We're all middle class. We're up about precarity as if we will understand it. One of my informants is now professor of English at a university in South Africa. He started out life as a Cameroonian migrant, moved to Cape Town under threat of death between the Anglo-Franco war, because it is a war. The only job he could get was a car guard, earning 50 South African rand a day. That's approximately $3.80 a day. Right? He went from there to earning 70 rand a day as a security guard. Why is it in those two positions? He literally became a street ethnographer and figured out where there were kind of gaps in commodity markets. And wherever there were, he bought stuff up and he sold it. And eventually he landed up putting himself through university and becoming a professor of English. He's now dean of the faculty. The interesting story about that is not that. It's not the upward mobility. The interesting story is the way he reflects on poverty. I said his name is Ignatius. I said to him, Ignatius, didn't you feel insecure? I said, no. I said, when you were earning 50 rand at $3.80, you weren't insecure? No. Do you know what precarity is? What's precarity? Precarity is feeling that you're living on the edge. That you feel, no, never did. But why? Because you don't get it, he said to me. He's right, I didn't get it. He said, look, one of the things that you have to understand among street people is that they have a high level of elasticity of consumer value. For example, let's say I earn 60 rand one day. I can rent a room. And so I move into this room and I rent all my things there. And then my income goes down to 30 rand a day. Does that mean I stop? No, he said, I don't. I get out of my room and I rent a bed. I don't need a room. I need a bed to sleep in. And then my salary drops a little lower, my income drops a little lower, and I don't really need a bed. I need 7 hours of sleep. So I rent the bed for 7 hours. And I rent out the same bed for the other, whatever it is, we can't count that, right? 14 hours, right? And so that bed, he's already subletting to make additional income. He has strategies, right? And so I said, no, he said, you just simply remodify your pattern of consumption. It's only you middle class folks who think you own a house, but you don't. You don't own a house, you own a debt. Right? And we think of middle classness as equity, right? I've got X or Y or Z, but actually we don't. What defines middle classness in the contemporary moment is access to debt. I can borrow enough to buy a house, I can borrow enough to buy a car, or whatever. We are basically debt strapped. We all, those of us who actually think we own our houses, etc., are actually statistically bankrupt. Because if somebody called in my house debt tomorrow, even a modest house, I can't pay it. My salary is below, unless I've been around a long time, have inherited money or whatever. We live in an unviable economy. So we define ourselves in exactly the opposite to what we are. Street people understand that. Right? And so their theory of precarity is about middle class, it's not about themselves. Now, social theory has got to take those things seriously. We operate with ideas of networks, of class, of etc., all of which we inherited from a generation that lived in the period exactly of the pre-war and post-war period. That's when I learned my anthropology. We all learned our anthropology. when we all learned about the Great Society, about government being ... and we grew up with the idea that government, the state, is an organization that collects private funds and puts it to the public good. That is exactly the opposite. The state takes public funds and redistributes it to the private sector. We now outsource government. The state has monopoly over the means of violence. The state now licenses out the means of violence. There's almost no feature of government that is not conducted in the private sector, including war. America buys most of its warmongering. Right? It outsources its torture techniques. Why? Because it becomes legally let's say irresponsible. Well, it's legally irresponsible. It's not responsible for stuff done in its name, and so on. The capacities, in other words, to disappear all kinds of liability go with it. In other words, we're working with very anachronistic views by default of our basic concepts. So the first challenge of this story is how do we begin to rethink our social theory for the 21st century that, in fact, doesn't merely literally ethnocentricizing, i.e. ethnocentrism isn't our only problem. Our other problem is detemporalizing it, moving it into the present from where it's kind of stuck in its own anachronism. So that's the first thing, the challenge to social theory. The second thing about the future of the academy is actually very threatening. My son, who's an architect and an academic, wrote a paper which he never dared publish about 10 years ago, in which he said the academy is dead. And he showed me, said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's very simple. You've got tenure, you're okay. I am entering the academy. Fortunately, he's an architect, so he earns money by respectful means as well. He said, look, what's going to happen to you is what's happened basically to the entire work sector. You're going to be put out of work, and academics are going to form companies, right? And universities are not going to hire faculty anymore. They're going to rent courses and services from those companies. So, we want a course in sociology. We go to Terry Silvio, we say, Terry, you've got this or that consulting company, so I know you this. And Alan's coming next, right? You have this company that sells social science coursework, etc. I need a course in social stratification, a course in ethnicity and nationhood, etc. And you'll supply it. What this means is get rid of tenure, get rid of retirement, get rid of all of that crap, get rid of the entire infrastructure of administration. All we need is a minimal skeletal thing, and that's how we will work. Faculty on expensive luxury, they will go as everything else goes. Now, he did this, by the way, at a time when he's an architect, right? And this came to at the time when he was trying to hire contractors and not being able to find contractors that weren't subcontracting everything. And he figured, well, because again, this is the same logic. Why keep a painter on your staff when he's only working X number of weeks ago? Unless you can actually keep people working at 110% of the time, it's actually not worth your while paying them retainers. You simply pay them by the hour. You don't have to worry about their insurance, their retirement, etc., etc. And he said, that's exactly what's going to happen to you guys. He's now waiting to try and get tenure as an academic. But the general point is we're not in a secure job. We think we're protected by tenure. Tenure can go very easily. Right? And what is more, universities everywhere are shrinking their tenured faculties, relying more on postdocs, on casualized. So we're in danger. Right? And robotics, well, think of how many universities are trying to introduce online courses, etc., etc. This stuff is happening. Now, as it happens, there is a strong argument for why universities are much better than collections of consultants. And the point about the market is they don't necessarily care about quality. It cares about what will be bought. Right? So if you say to a potential neoliberal theorist of the future of the academy, but we give this hands-on to tutorial work and office hours and things like that. We can hire that. We give writing courses. We've got any number of online courses for that. Why should we bother with you? And the answer is very difficult to give because we are living in a counter-enlightenment where the faith in the sociality and the human contact is actually under stress. After all, think of how much of your time, my time, is basically now online, where we sacrifice person-to-person relationship, and in fact we avatar ourselves in order precisely to vacate sociality when we think, that's another part of appearing as it disappears. Sociality appears and disappears behind screens, right? Now, if that appears behind screens, why can't office be conducted by Skype? Why should we hide anybody? Why should we give them a notice when we can do all that stuff electronically and digital? So, yeah, one cannot take for granted that the Academy is going to look in 25 years as it looks now. What is more, we are dangerous politically. We teach students to do and think all kinds of stuff, right? Which states would much rather prefer us not to do. And so the universities are quite vulnerable. The universities in the States are under attack. It's no mistake that the Trump administration has joined as an amicus almost every class action against the university, because the universities are under attack. This is why the NSF's funds have been cut down, etc., etc. These aren't mistakes. We're living in a country like that. And so we're under threat. So on the one hand, the necessity to re-theorize the present, including our own precarity, the future of the academy, and third of all, pedagogy. What should our pedagogy consist of? That is a huge, huge question. Something I spend an enormous amount of time with my graduate students teaching. Where does the politics of pedagogy lie? Where does pedagogy as an emancipatory practice lie? How do we, in fact, engage our students with what our teachers engaged us in my case in apartheid South Africa? How does one change the world? After all, pedagogy is not about simple reproduction. It's about thinking forward. That's why we teach history. The only point of history, Nietzsche is right, is about the future. So what are we offering our students about the future? What are we offering our students as a rationale to understand the past, or indeed other cultures or anything else? And that is a huge question that we have to address. So theorize as much as we like. Pedagogy carries within it a deep politics, and we don't spend enough time talking about it. So those are three. The ice is broken.
Okay. This is not a question. This is, I want to pass.
Thank you.
I want to pass on an observation to see what you think of it. The observation is due to Nakamaki Hirochika, who just retired from Impaku in Japan. And it occurs to me because you mentioned specifically the years 1945 to 70 as the source of the mythical period that we all look back at. What Nakamaki Sensei points out is that that is the period in which all of the OECD countries were basically dealing with what to do with conscript armies that were being demobilized. And suggests that it is possible to trace a lot of social thought and theory, including a certain egalitarianism in the ranks, meritocracy, the idea of a state that provides food, shelter, medical care, and what have you, to the experience of people who were in the military and in the war. And of course, as we know in the States in particular, what's happened is that the Reagan Revolution and that occurs precisely at the point that those guys are dying off. And I just wonder, that seems to me, because I know that anthropological theory almost never thinks about the military.
Yeah, you're right about that. But you know, first of all, thank you for that, because it's a very acute observation, and great that you brought in this conversation. You know, I've thought about that a lot. I also read that, and I think that there are two pieces missing to it. I think it's an astute observation, by the way, and I think he's right. I think, in fact, the demographies of post-wars are critical. After all, there's a theory. I mean, I subscribe to the theory that there weren't two world wars. That there was one world war with a brief-ish ceasefire, and a ceasefire that was in fact doomed to failure because it didn't attend to Weimar and to the in effect what happens to losers. What happens to losers often, in effect, create the conditions for subsequent wars. So, you know, I think there's an enormous amount of emphasis to be put on the post-war period. I happened to be born the first day of the war, the year the war ended, so I have a particular affection for this period, right? And grew up actually very much in the wake of the war. Yeah, you must have as well. I mean, I grew up in the age when rations still applied. I remember the first time I had meat that was fresh. Okay, and I was about 6 years old at the time. So, you know, and my parents talked obsessively about the war. So I think that the demobilization issue, the Marshall Plan, etc., were absolutely foundational to that period being imagined. But there are two other factors, right, which really do require attention. The one is women. Right? After all, Rosie the Riveter is an absolutely critical piece of the story. Right? After all, this was the first time that the global north discovered that the industrial economy could be run extremely successfully on women's labor. Okay? In this instance, of course, desperately underpaid women's labor by virtue of the excuse of the war. Right? In effect, women could be paid much better within the war economy, but they weren't. At the same time, this created an enormous shock for the demobilized. You know, what was the logic of returning men to women who were doing literally running the economy extremely efficiently? And not only Rosie the Riveter, but the story that Rosie the Riveter forgot, which was, who is the Rosie the Riveter's forewoman? And who, in effect, were the middle range executives? Women, of course. And so what created this comfort of the idea of male the breadwinner really imploded with the war. So the post-war is not merely a matter of demobilizing men, but also of the reconstruction of the myth of the family. And that required enormous amounts of social investment in males. The other factor that is not mentioned that is decolonization. 1947, August 1947 for India, in the late 50s onwards for Africa, etc. And that made a huge difference because that reconfigured the Cold War and it really required what was then calling itself the First World. Amazing, America, you know, the World Cup, the Super Bowl, the world, everything, the First World, etc. Had a real problem. After all, the war gave an enormous amount of credence to socialism. Right? It was no mistake that half of Africa became socialist very quickly, or that Bandung happened. Right? And so America had to come up with the Great Society, with a notion of really a post-war version of the New Deal, i.e. it had to invest an enormous amount in social programs to remain even remotely plausible. But as a result, you know, the figures that hold control in both parties today, you know, the Trump generation among Republicans, the Bernie Biden generation, that do not want to give up power, and who really very much want that kind of middle-of-the-road image of a liberal democratic America, which actually is unsustainable, nonetheless is so powerful as it is. So I think that's a very important observation. But I think it has to be clothed with, as it were, decolonization and the story of women, because the rest is only art.
Yeah, I think as I understand it though, I knew Nakamaki in the context of the Kei Jinrigaku group, the Anthropology of Administration and Business Organization. And he was very concerned with the fact that when the soldiers, basically when Japan rebuilt itself, you know, it had industrial armies in place. It had large masses of men used to wearing uniforms, working together in a disciplined manner, mass action in large-scale industry, heavy industry factories and stuff like that. And it's sort of almost like the military life predisposed the men who came back to a kind of what we now think of as a great society, democratic, socialist, meritocratic kind of society, because that's what they had experienced, along with the fact that, especially in the U.S., they had literally been, through conscription, thrown into these classic movie scenes where you've got the guy from Oklahoma and the guy from Brooklyn who are in the same foxhole together. And so there was a lot of that sort of laid the groundwork. And the fact then pointing to the fact that once you get past about 1970, the average American male no longer has that experience.
No, I think that's true. But, you know, sociologically that's true, but it requires, as it were, something more in order to mobilize that difference. You know, it's interesting because there's now quite a lot large literature on the history of what we call neoliberalism. And I keep saying what we call it because ultimately it's a very ill-fitting adjective in that it's very much like capitalism in the sense that we label a series of contradictory, as it were, diacritica of the moment, and there's a danger in giving it a label because it pretends to a greater degree of coherence. But nonetheless, the literature on the coming of the moment, and it's really burgeoning very quickly, really debates over the extent to which the rise of this new beast, of new conservatism, etc., was a conspiracy on the part of a right wing acting against the advances made during that period. To what extent it, in fact, had its own sociology of the post-war and therefore reacted against the problem posed by the demobbed, the problem posed by the civil rights movement, etc., and as it were, this becomes their solution. Now, that's, of course, Naomi Klein argues this in Shock Doctrine. David Harvey argues it in his History of Neoliberalism, and that's led to the debate. To what extent was this actually a class war, if you like, or a war on the part of capital? To what extent was it a reflection of the internal contradictions that the history of capitalism itself, refracted through the war, produced? And I think that debate's going to go on for a very long time. And frankly, I don't think it's an either-or. I think it's a both-and. I think that those two things, the historical conditions, the structural conditions, gave, as it were, opportunities into which specific forms of political action, political economic action, predisposed the corporations, predisposed the right wing to seize the kinds of initiatives that they did. So I think that there is a both-and there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But thanks for that's a wonderful observation. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question about, because I and many people are very fascinated about the three creatures. The three creatures, they are both human, non-human, living, dead, present, and absent, zombie, mutants, and robots. I think they are very metaphorical, and they also signal to the human condition of ideological centrality of work. But you also said in the very beginning, and also on your paper, that wage labor is the ontological, indispensable core of capitalism. For me, there are two separate questions. For me, yeah. For example, I will give you an example. A mayor candidate in Kaohsiung City, Han Kuo-yu, his slogan was making big wealth or making prosperity. So he repeated many times, just like the way maybe the president or I forgot. He repeated 37 times of more works. Okay, yeah, in a relatively short of time. So it's like the spell or Han Kuo-yu was using was making big wealth, but contrast with the more works. I was wondering if Han Kuo-yu said more works, will he become the mayor? Probably not, because we are already overworking with very low wage. So that's how I
feel the same.
So that's how I disentangle human condition of the human condition of ideological centrality of work and wage labor as the core of capitalism. But because you use the term ontological, right? You are very cautious in the talk that you only mention ontological maybe once or twice, but in the paper maybe a little bit more times. So I would like to ask, will you disentangle these two? Because I do think they are different concepts.
You mean the ontology of labor and the
ontology of labor as a core in capitalism,
yeah,
and the centrality of work as a human condition.
Okay. I think that they are intimately related to one another. They occur at different theoretical levels, right? Ontology addresses the condition of being, right? And capitalism founded itself on a particular theory of the way of wage labor. Without wage labor and without its privatization, etc., there is no concept of capitalism. There are any number of forms of work, as we know, but without, as it were, labor as a condition of being, one can't conceive of capitalism as a theoretical system. Okay, and that's the level of the theoretical level at which that statement resides. The idea of work experientially as the way we engage with capitalism itself an abstraction, right? We talk about capitalism, but you can't see capitalism no more than you can see a family. I mean, think ethnographically. When you say, here is a family, you don't see a family. You see people interacting in a particular kind of way, and you make the abstract statement, this is a family, right? And so the notion of the family is an ethnographic abstraction, not an ethnographic observation, not an empirical thing. The same is true of the relation between work and labor. Labor is an abstract form. And you know, in both Marxist theory and Weberian theory, there's a difference between the abstract and the concrete. And of course, Marxists have been arguing forever what actually Marx meant by abstract and concrete, and there are dozens of theories to exist. But what these refer to are different levels of abstraction. So, on the one hand, given that it's impossible to think of the existence of capitalism without the relation between labor and capital, however you phrase it, as a relation of production, as a structural contradiction for purposes of politics, as a semantic opposition, because ultimately, in a Saussurean sense, one cannot have capital without its outsides, and its effective outside is labor. And so that is what is meant by ontology. But of course, we don't live in ontologies, we don't live in abstractions. Those are the theoretical models we build about them. The sociological models that we engage with are based, in fact, on empirical observation, right? An empirical observation of the history of capitalism is really about the history of the way in which labor and its purchases have operated. And perhaps because, and this is a theoretical question, but perhaps because of the hegemonic, the taken for granted notion that we actually earn our keep through our work, so that work is central to our engagement with work. Now, this is not a necessary condition, it's a sociological condition. After all, the workers, David Graeber is of the world, and David was my student, so I was grilled with this for years, say, well, we don't need work. In fact, after work is great. It frees us to do all kinds of other things. And why should we define work in the mode that capitalism defines it? And of course, that's an anarchist position, which holds that ultimately it's possible to conceive of a different kind of world entirely. It's very hard when it comes to the substance of what that world would look like. Maybe retirement. I don't know. So I better suggest that, early retirement. But that makes the point that we're making, that ultimately work remains central to our phenomenological relationship to capitalism. How does one envisage a world, a personal existence without it? And that's precisely why, to go back to our first question, why the reaction to the Ferguson book amongst those, both those who had work and those who were out of work, they didn't say, okay, great, give us whatever, yang, $1,000 a month, and we're perfectly happy not to work. Our masculinity goes with that, our being goes with that, our femininity goes with that recognition of the value of what we do. So in that's the sense of work as central. They engage with different levels of the way we describe reality. Okay?
I want to ask you about politics and the state in this new age of capitalism. You just, as Ferguson and many other scholars say, the state is more and more like corporations in this neoliberal age. But the state is more and more like a corporation. Doesn't mean the state should be a corporation or the state is a corporation. And you also talk about how U.S. and Britain, make unemployment disappear by using all these statistical figures and how they count unemployment people. And so that when the state acts like that, when the state has the power to make unemployment disappear, it's very different from the state acting like a corporation.
Oh, corporations make work disappear as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so, and then you didn't really talk much about the counterforce of all these phenomena, all this, what we are facing today. And so I would like to invite you to talk a little bit about politics. What should we do in this age?
Okay, no, great. Thank you for that. The second question is basically asking to rewrite the history of the world. No, it's a legitimate question, of course. Just go back to the question of the state. I think this is really important because I really do think the social sciences have a responsibility for rethinking the nature of the state. Now, to say that a state becomes more and more corporate-like doesn't preclude the possibility of politics. After all, one one might argue that one of the oldest corporations in the world is the Catholic Church. And seriously, I mean, it follows all the classic definition. It's a legal person. It holds enormous wealth in it, and at the same time, it's a political force, right? As well as everything else. Now, that's not to disrespect it. That's simply to sociologize it. The same is true with many institutions. The point here being that corporations are also deeply political institutions and spend an enormous amount of their time and their assets in reshaping political decision making. The amount of money that corporations spend on lobbying is huge, and the point is that they're spending money on politics. So the notion that there's something separate between the corporate existence of any institutional form and its engagement in politics, that doesn't address an opposition, it addresses a subsumption. And in fact, of course, what the neoliberal age has marked in many parts of the world is state capture. That is, the capture of the functions of state by corporations, which is measured in the outsourcing of the functions of government into the corporate sector. In South Africa, for example, has a massive state commission now called the Zondo Commission, and its charter is to analyze state capture by corporate structures. And so, in a way, the state as a mega corporation is in effect reacting against lower order corporations, which are in fact engaging with it. Now, when I say mega corporation, I mean, I always make my students laugh by saying big McDonald's, right? Why think McDonald's? Because McDonald's has never made a cent out of selling hamburgers. No, it doesn't. It makes sense. It sells the right to sell hamburgers. Right? So you buy a franchise, the franchise holder takes all the risk, McDonald's gets the royalty. Okay? That's how it makes its money. Real capital makes its money out of intellectual property, not out of production. Okay? And that's how companies operate. They create holding trust. Pardon? Donald Trump is a case in point. And Donald Trump is making a fortune out of the presidency. It really is. I mean, in fact, the amount of money being spent by foreign governments, corporations, the US military in these hotels, etc., is, I mean, it's legend, right? He goes somewhere, 1,000 security personnel go with him, and they're going to be housed somewhere at one of the Trump institutions. I mean, it became a joke. Was he or was he not going to host the G7 at one of his golf courses? That was seriously mooted. He really seriously thought about buying greenhouse, right? So he talked about buying countries. The point here being that liberal thought, and indeed the history of the disciplines, has always separated politics and economics. That's a modernist distinction, right? Of course, in the age before modernity, in the 18th century, they were thought as one thing. Marx wrote about political economy because he didn't think they were separable. And in fact, their conflation is really part of our times. So the political and economic become literally inseparable. And so the notion of state capture by corporations, the outsourcing of government, has changed the nature of the state. At the same time, as a holding company, states really do act as legal personae. France sued for the right to use the term campaign. I go to champagne. It was a campaign to stop champagne. I'm missing H, sorry. South Africa sued to maintain its right over various of its tea production, which in fact is a major state. Most nation states are now. Singapore used 2008 to buy half the banking system of Switzerland, right? So we talk about mega economics here. And the notion of the two things being easily separate. And indeed, Russia conducted an enormous amount of foreign policy in relation to Belarus, to the Ukraine, by controlling the supplies of petrol through Gazprom. Right? So Gazprom was, in fact, the CEO of Gazprom became the prime minister and then the president. The years that Putin wasn't president, the president was Medvedev. Who was Medvedev? The CEO of Gazprom. Right? So these have become extremely interwoven with one another, which is precisely why I say we need to re-theorize the nature of stateness. And of course, whether the state exists at all, right? Phillips Abrams' famous point, does the state actually exist? Or is government merely its own form of corporation that deploys the state as an ideological assertion of its own authority? Philip Abrams' essay is famous on this. What is a state? Well, the state's another kind of abstraction, to go back to the ontology question. it's an abstraction which we use to talk about regimes and government. When we say the American state, we mean Donald Trump and his administration talking in the name of stateless. Right? And in that sense, the state it's very much like an African ancestor. What is an African ancestor? An African ancestor is a lineage authority. Why? Lineage elders who hand down decisions, who make decisions. How do they authorize their decision? Because they're talking in the name of the ancestors. If I screw up, it's not me, it's the ancestors. Why you've got to do it? It's because of the ancestors, i.e. I'm merely the vector of a greater authority. And that's exactly how governments talk all the time. But there's no reality out there that is talking through them. They're talking into it and out of its mouth again. And so that authorizes and legitimizes the forms of corporate action in which they engage. So those are complicated relationships. But again, they are a demand to theorize anew precisely how these things are happening. And the very fact the state outsources almost all the means of government means that, in fact, it is like McDonald's, a franchise holder in the functions of government. And they are very profitable functions. Right? You look mystified.
I mean, I got it, but the thing is, just as a citizen or as a human being, I just find it unacceptable. I mean, for example, I do feel...
I'm not suggesting you should.
Yeah, I do feel in the Philippines and among the Bukala or the so-called Ilonggot. And the Philippine government has this new policy of giving teenagers, children under 15, kind of monthly, something like 300 peso. Yeah, for them, for nourishment or other things. And the people in upland village, they cannot get it in their village. They have to travel to much closer to the lowland. And like my adopted sister in the village, she went to Bilase every month. And then she has 3 children, so she receives 900 peso. But the thing is that for the jeepney ride, for the food, she need on the 2 day, at least 2 days, coming back and forth. And then she almost spend all the money. And so, just, the state, as a corporate, giving them this subsidy, and they don't give it to them. They do not provide the service in the village, so they have to go to the lowland, to whatever, And this is and it's something very similar is happening in Manila too, They, in order to get this 300 peso, they have to show that they have disciplined themselves. Their children have to go to school or...
a lot of basic income grants work that way, by the way. The Brazilian one does as well. The Bolsa Familia, the amount given is conditional on how it's used. So it's given to women, and if women use it on their children, etc., they can get a bonus. If they don't get the bonus. So this becomes, in fact, a mode of management. It's always been a mode of management since it started. But that has to do with a whole new regime of social grants and basic incomes. Again, it goes back to the first question, and how they mobilize. And of course, the basic income grant, when it first was introduced, in Brazil, Namibia, under another name in South Africa, social grant system, etc., all were tied to a neoliberal notion of the recipient, almost invariably a woman or a child, as literally an entrepreneur herself who had to use that money in the approved kind of way. And that's one of the ways that regimes, not states, regimes, portray themselves in a highly paternal kind of way, and in fact vote bought through this. And of course, I don't expect anybody to like the new form of state, merely to understand the new form of state. These are new forms of state rationalities, government rationalities that have ideological structures to them. They don't just happen. Of course, Duterte and the Philippine regime, they're a particular kind of regime in relation to the law and its social policy. But that's another story entirely. But the notion of the way that governments work in the name of the state and engage in their own forms of neoliberalization often have precisely the idea of making citizens into entrepreneurs in themselves, responsibilizing them, etc. And I might add, at enormous costs to people who previously expected to be serviced by the state. For example, when British Rail sold itself off for a pittance actually. It sold itself off really, really cheaply. The Maggie Thatcher regime was as corrupt as hell when it came to selling off people's, including, by the way, the son, making $400 million out of the arms deal. There are a lot of stories there, but the general point was that as soon as those things were privatised, the rail services to the remoter parts of Scotland, Northern England, etc., were simply retracted as unprofitable. So people didn't have the resources to go to the post office to get their pensions. Exactly the same story. Because the rail companies didn't care, they didn't have to care. They operated as purely as profitable company. So transport gets outsourced in the private sector, and it's run as a different kind of profit rationality. And the same was repeated with water. My own water bill in Britain went up by 400%, and the service became really worse, and when it was a state monopoly. So those things are kind of working complicated ways.
I think the last question.
Okay.
Because time is.
Okay, I didn't know that I got the last question, so it's a good way to end the talk. Anywho, so thank you for the talk. When I heard the talk, after the title, after labor, what brought to my mind was not necessarily about anthropology of labor or theories of labor, but more about leisure, about play and all that. And I was wondering if you have anything to say about the relationship between leisure nowadays. I'm asking this mostly because now we see a lot of YouTubers and all people like that on social media live streaming their life that were not necessarily part of what we will consider as work, and then they capitalize on these aspects of life, and that brings us some interesting questions about also the anthropology of consumptions, where technically when we talk about consumption, we usually focus on the consumers and their relationship with the products, but we don't necessarily focus on the laborers and the production that went into it. And then now with this kind of merging between leisure and labor with the modern technology, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about this and share with us.
Actually, I've got a lot of thoughts, unsurprisingly. No, I think it's a fascinating question because, of course, the whole notion of the separation of labor and leisure arises with industrial capitalism, right? And the notion of the construction of the weekend, the labor time, which, of course, becomes the object of politics, to go back to your issue, becomes a very heavily politicized issue. To what extent do children work, and basically how one constructs modern personhood under that regime. And the enormous amount of theories about labor being recreation, i.e. the reproduction of the energies of self, etc., etc. So in fact, I think this is what Foucault, for example, meant by talking about labor as a theology, right? That is to say, it constructed a particular idea of personhood which had things like the idea of the Sabbath, sabbatical, recreation, etc., regenesis, all terms that evoke a theological as well as a culture of personhood. And of course, labor-leisure becomes, like the public-private, becomes foundational to the notion of the construction itself. After all, if we all engage in production by virtue of selling our labor time becomes a unit of our value. And therefore, one cannot conceive of somebody who's working all the time, because that deunitizes the possible. And that was always the problem, inverted commas, of devaluing women's work. Women's work was perpetual, right? And so the argument was it couldn't be reduced to labor time, and it was done in the sacred space of the home. So it lay between labor and leisure, as nurture did. And that's why it didn't fit into the terms in which labor-leisure was constructed under capitalism. So there's a long theological as well as a sociological root to the question. The interesting thing becomes when, in effect, leisure becomes a commodity. Now, Nick Cohen's book on that dates it really to the late 1940s, just after Second World War. It goes back to that notion. After Second World War, the notion of leisure as commodity enters into public discourse in a new kind of way. How do we sell leisure? How do we market leisure? Of course, the moment that one poses a question in those terms, leisure becomes part of the commodity economy in a very particular kind of way. And more, self-making becomes, as it were, as much the object of leisure as it does the object of work. And from there we move to a constant fuzzing of the line. And of course, as we move into the 70s, the neoliberal moment, where the self as capital, the whole notion of the difference between leisure and labor begins to disappear. And in effect, precisely for the reasons you give. I can put myself on webcam and charge. God knows anybody would want to watch. That's another story. But people do. And the notion of gaming as a huge industry, I mean, is extraordinary. And in fact, that's maybe its best instantiation. But also, in effect, of course, those relations, I think, also underwent a radical transformation with the professionalization of other things like sport. Now, after all, I'm a crazy Manchester United fan. I'll declare truth in advertising here, so I'll accept sympathies later. But, for years, I lived in Manchester for 10 years. I used to go to watch Manchester United in. And in those days, like in the 70s, one thought of it as a sport. Most of the players were British, and in effect, it was exactly as it was. Manchester United was primarily Catholic, it was primarily Jewish Protestant, and Manchester was Catholic. This was a sociology of the city, okay? Everybody understood it as such. Comes the EU, and suddenly soccer labour changes. Now soccer labour can go anywhere, right? It becomes the object of mass mediation. These teams now get bought by mega capitalists. So now, what we're talking about is a huge industry. Right? And basically, Manchester United versus Manchester City is my capitalists versus your capitalists. Right? Mine happen to come from America, yours happen to come from the Gulf. Okay? Our players come from everywhere. Very few of them have anything to do with locality, and yet we behave as though they do. And so the notion here of people getting extremely engaged in this mega industry as though it were simply play is an instance of exactly the same thing. And its capitalization is enormous. So the notion of making oneself in those kinds of terms, and are the players the ideology of the sport is fascinating. Every time a player looks like they're doing something that isn't for a dollar a turn, the media immediately say, see, they're playing for the game. As if you have to prove that there's actually sport behind all this stuff. Okay? Because actually, there's very little. The real terms exist entirely in the market. And in fact, so the notion of labour and leisure in those kinds of ways enfold both in cyberspace, cyber time, and in terrestrial space and time. And so it's very hard anymore when one talks about somebody being playful, one is not necessarily talking about leisure at all. One is often talking about modalities of style which have to do directly with their commodification. After all, if one thinks about the fashion industry is deliberately about the commodification of play. Right? It is about precisely the ways in which one makes a temporality the engagement of a form of playful self-representation, which at the same time, of course, is about self-commodification. It is literally working the self as a form of human capital. So I think modernist ideas of labour and leisure in that easy form of opposition have really imploded. But they've imploded in interesting ways. When I say what I'm saying, this is not as a sense of regret, but as a sense of interest, because there's something profoundly interesting when binaries go. And of course, the disappearance of binaries manifest themselves everywhere. After all, we all grew up, us who are aged, with two genders, right, male, female, and the non-heteronormative was thought of as a category. Now we think much more in terms of gender as a continuum, as exactly the way Foucault talked about it in the pre-modern moment. Hercule Barbin, the notion of what is gender is de-binarized in very radical kinds of ways. We're de-binarizing a lot of things, right? And that between work and leisure, male and female, space and time, etc., are all, in fact, under re-speculation, which is why I started my first answer to icebreaking by saying time has come for re-theorizing a lot of stuff, including the notion of binary thought. And in a way, binary thought is especially difficult because, of course, digitization makes binaries, in effect, the elemental forms of the way one thinks. Because ultimately digital logic is about presences and absences. And it's precisely that needs to be transcended order to be understood. We're facing a complicated phenomenal age, but starting with literally debinarizing a lot of our thinking is critical for that. So the challenge to go back is a challenge to think theoretically in an age which militates against theory. There is a strong tendency in the social sciences to move to crypto-empiricism away from theory. And that is a disaster, because the degree to which we don't understand the world, we simply live it in the kinds of ways that you're worried about. That is to say, by virtue of the taken for granted the normalization coming back to haunt us, very, very serious. On the other hand, one cannot live without hope, without challenge. So, re-theorize the world. It's a great place to start with. And that way, maybe we won't become redundant or irrelevant or simply robots. With these the robot in South Africa is a term for a traffic light. Traffic lights are either red or they're green. I prefer the green.
We still have question? The last one. Okay, make it brief.
The end of your paper, or the ends of your paper.
The end of the ends, because they're different.
Yes. I like titles. Ethnicity incorporated after labor. Just two things. And it turns out I don't have anything to say about labor, but I have a lot of opinions about the word after. I think it's one of the most dangerous words in the English language. It's important. Yeah. You read my mind. It's important to have.
My mind's unreadable.
It's important to have critiques of modernity, for which we have something called critical theory. But once you call it a postmodern theory, then you've created a different kind of problem, because the obvious question is, how can you speak from the position of the post? And how do you know, why do you assume that the post has anything to do with what precedes it? Now, the most egregious misuse of the term is not postmodernism, but post-colonial theory. I mean, it took a while for us to discover that what is called post-colonial theory actually has nothing to do with after colonialism, but was referring to the imaginings floating around in Homibabo's head, among other things. So, you mentioned Max Weber several times. Max Weber actually had a very elegant definition of class. He said you can't define class without its context in a market situation. So therefore, wealth is different from capital in the same way labor comes out of it. So let me provoke you directly by saying this paper was not about labor, because you can't talk about after labor unless you address the question of after capitalism.
Well, it's very interesting to even speculate whether one can think of anything as after capitalism. After here, you'll notice, because you notice everything, is use the pun. Right? After as in resembling, something is after something else, right? And the point that we're making is precisely that there isn't an after labor. There is, in effect, a constant reformation, a constant metamorphosis, and a displacement. And so the notion of after labor here is what resembles the kinds of labor we have, but in the nature of the contemporary. Because precisely that's exactly what we're saying. We say that there is a problem with the end of labor thesis, because we don't know this end of labor. There are plenty of people working, right? But what has changed is its demography, and in effect, the notion that things resembling orthodox labor are occurring but in different economies. Right? So the after plays on the notion of a resemblance, and as it were, an after the thesis of the end of work. Okay? So in that sense, that is where the play on the after is. It's not about post-labor. We don't use the term post-labor for precisely the reasons that you say. There is no post-labor, and there isn't a post-capitalism. This is one of the reasons that I feel very uncomfortable with the notion of late capitalism. I don't know, capitalism late. As I understand, late means dead, right? As in the late John Comaroff. That's the one that nobody pays any attention to.
After you leave, we'll have a discussion group and we'll call it after Comaroff.
No, you won't. Hopefully it's after Comaroff's departure.
Just 2 words.
Yeah, but there's also elegance in one word. And I give you no idea what it is. but seriously, I take the point well, except that I contest this only Homo Bala said. There are a few other heads as well. I just think I could be mortified to hear you align on that. Right. But she claims to have a very strong head as well, which she does. But anyway, that's another point. No, but seriously, I think that the notion of the post is always way too easy. The only utility of the post is in effect what it suggests for understanding the phenomenon that it's supposed to be not about, right? I.e., the utility of thinking about post-modernity. What in the hell is modernity, right? Because actually, we don't. We cannot argue that the post means after a law. Only that one has an advantage backwards over its history up to this point, which is a very different notion of it. But looking back, looking after, in the sense of taking care of, is not a bad idea, not a bad metaphor for thinking about the nature of modernity. After all, have we really resolved what capitalism was? It goes back to your ontological point. Wherein lies the ontology of anything whose presence in the world is continued. And in that sense, the only history that we know is continuous present. So, yeah, I could give you more. Sorry, I hate not to disagree.
I do hope Professor Comaroff will publish another article or books again like last time after this lecture. So we will end this lecture here. Thank you again.